Hello, class. This week we're talking about conspiracy theories. So to help us with our criteria and applying them to conspiracy theories, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about my favorite. That is to say, crop circles. Crop circles are my favorite because the criteria apply pretty unambiguously and they lead to a fairly definitive answer. But remember, for inference to the best explanation, we're dealing in probabilities. Inductive arguments all carry risk, and that is not a criticism of inductive arguments. The best inductive arguments only imply their conclusions probably. But in many cases, that's totally good enough to go on. What else are we going to believe? It would be irrational to believe the second best explanation when we have another one that's better. It's not irrational to change our minds. It could be that the best explanation for a theory or a phenomenon is one explanation at one time, and after new evidence emerges, it's a different explanation at a different time. That's perfectly reasonable. We ought to change our minds as the evidence changes. Crop circles is a great example where we can put ourselves in the shoes of people who may have come before, but we can look back and think, our criteria got it right, and they probably would have gotten it right the whole time. So let's talk. Crop circles started popping up around the 70s and 80s. They spread more in the 80s and 90s, and you don't hear too much about them anymore. But when they did pop up, it was quite a fantastic sight. You can imagine being a farmer walking out to his crops or her crops and seeing a design like you're seeing right now. What's the best explanation for this? Well, if you've seen the movie Signs, you might think the best explanation could be aliens, or at least an explanation that many people gravitated toward. Crop circles were very large. They may have taken up an acre or 2 acres or even more. So we're going to look at 3 different quick theories to see which of the possible theories or explanations is best. The first will be that crop circles were caused by wind vortices. The second theory will be that crop circles were caused by aliens. And the last theory will be that crop circles are caused by humans. What we're going to do is state our theory, which we just did, and we'll check them for consistency. So far, so good. Let's assume they're all internally consistent. That means they don't contradict themselves, at least. And we'll assume they at least fit the data they're allegedly meant to explain. And then we'll look for evidence of the theory. We'll look at the alternatives. And then we're going to test them with our criteria. If we recall, our criteria are testability, fruitfulness, scope, simplicity, and conservatism. Let's do a quick review. Testability is either a yes or a no. A theory is either testable or it isn't. Some theories become testable as technology advances when they otherwise weren't testable at the time. Einstein's general relativity theory is an example of this. After he proposed it, scientists knew right away that his theory implied something, namely that light would bend, or at least appear to bend, around massive objects, but it couldn't be tested until the experiments by Sir Eddington, when there was the great eclipse in, I believe it was 1919. So testability is a yes or a no. A theory is either testable or it isn't. And I mean testable in principle. So relativity was always testable in principle. It just took an advancement in technology, a precise telescope, and waiting for an eclipse for that test to happen. Luckily for Einstein, his prediction was right. Isaac Newton was wrong. We prefer Einsteinian general relativity to Newtonian physics even today. Our second criteria is fruitfulness. What we want here is for a theory or an explanation to give us other areas where we can go look for things we didn't know before. Does a theory or an explanation make predictions so that we know what to go look for? Let's think of Einstein's example just one more time. His theory predicted light would bend around massive objects. That was a brand new prediction that Newtonian physics did not predict. So that new prediction gave us something we could go look for. Hey, here's this new thing that we didn't know about. Let's go see if it's true. Fruitful theories yield testable predictions that are new. And generally, we prefer theories that make the most of these. They can advance research programs, produce new science and new discoveries, and true theories typically do this. They're an advancement over previous theories. Third up is scope. We like theories with broader scope. An example of a theory that has broader scope might be something like the alien theory, and this will come up. But one area where alien theorists often try to put their theories forward is over alien sightings, right? There are UFO sightings. And no one denies that there are UFO sightings where a pilot or someone might see an object in the sky that can't be identified. So far, so good. No problem there. But what's the best explanation for this? Is the best explanation that this person or this pilot saw a spacecraft from some other planet that was entering our atmosphere? Or is it that they saw some other shape, perhaps, and their mind or brain imposed a particular shape onto it? Well, we happen to know that human perception is constructive. It's why we look at the clouds and we see bunnies and dragons and castles, and not always random blobs of water vapor. So we know our minds are constructive. So that theory that our perception is constructive, that we build patterns out of the myriad of impressions that are impacting our senses, we know that already. And that theory could potentially, I will say could potentially explain why we often see things that get reported as UFO sightings when there is not, in fact, that kind of object there. That would be a theory that has broad scope. And if we're comparing the two theories, we might prefer the one with broader scope. Generally, they turn out to be true. Probably. Up fourth is simplicity. All else being equal, the simplest explanation is usually right. There's a great line in the movie The Usual Suspects that I happen to like, where the detective, played by Chaz Palminteri, is talking to the character played by Kevin Spacey. And he says, there's no arch criminal behind it all. You see a guy in the street who's brought in for murder and you think his brother did it, you're going to find out you're right. Like, for a cop, the world is simple. Events have simple explanations. If you find someone and you think they did it and there's insurance money to be had, they probably did. You could be wrong, but they probably did. And that theory might tell you other things you can now go look for. Could they be having an affair? Could there be another family going on? Was there trouble in the marriage? Good theories give you other things to look for. That was fruitfulness. And good theories are usually simpler than their rivals. I will tell you, most conspiracy theories fail wildly when it comes to simplicity. There are almost always simpler explanations to be had. Now, we can't know with certainty that one is true and the other is false. But again, we are dealing with inductive arguments. And in the absence of anything else, the simplest theory is to be preferred. Conservativeness is the criteria that has to do with other things we know about the world. We aren't doing science in a vacuum. We have established knowledge. We know the Earth is about 4.54 billion years old. If a new theory comes along that implies the Earth is 400,000 years old, that new theory is probably false, because we have really good reason already for thinking the Earth is far older. Now, we could be wrong. It's possible. The question is, what should we believe? Should we believe the new theory that contradicts a well-established old theory, or should we not? That is our choice. And we have to think of it kind of like gambling. We're placing our bets. If we're going to bet that a theory is true, do we want to bet on the new, unproven theory that contradicts something we have good reason to believe? Or do we not want to place that bet? We could be wrong and we could lose our money. But odds are we're going to be right if we bet on simple theories. Odds are we're going to be right if we bet on conservative theories. There are things we have good reason for believing, and bad theories tend to contradict those, and good theories don't. Let's see how that comes up when we talk about crop circles, my favorite conspiracy. So we could talk about wind vortices. A wind vortex is a crop circle, at least the theory claims that crop circles created by small whirlwinds of electrified air. This is the wind vortex. So imagine a dust devil, right? The little swoop of wind you might see in a parking lot that picks up a paper bag or something. And these wind vortexes or vortices discharge electricity that supposedly flattens the grain in swirl patterns. Well, is there any direct evidence for these? Well, no, of course. No one's ever seen a wind vortex do this. But in a lab, you can produce these. Some people claim to have seen a ball of light after seeing some things like this. And there's some photographic evidence for something called ball lightning and so forth. People claim that to hear strange sounds when there's a crop circle reported the next day as if it's the wind vortex possibly spinning. So maybe there's some indirect evidence for the wind vortex theory. But this is pretty weak evidence. For one, An electrified swirl of air can only be done in a lab. 2, eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. This is why we care about things like corroboration. If one person sees something, okay, like that's some evidence, right? Normally our perception isn't totally way off. If 2 people see it, that's more. If those 2 people don't know each other, that might count as more independent corroboration. If they're seeing it under specific experimental circumstances, that counts way more than when we see something out in the so-called, in the real world, right? Experimental conditions matter because we can control variables and we can control temperature and we can control how tired we are and so on. So that this ball lightning is really only ever seen by isolated witnesses with little corroboration, and it's only ever been done in a lab, that doesn't lend much weight to the wind vortex theory. That's a picture of ball lightning, by the way, which is a real phenomenon. So theory 1 doesn't really seem to fit. But also think about this. A spinning thing of air might be able to create the crop circle you are seeing on one side of the page, but could a spinning vortex of air create the one on the other side? I take it you would be shocked if a tornado swept through the Midwest and in the piles of rubble and debris, the pattern that you're seeing that's very elaborate with lots of different geometric shapes was the pattern that the debris was spread out in. I think you might say the odds of that would be near 0, if not 0. So because we've seen crop circles in those complicated shapes, the wind vortex theory can't even explain those. So let's talk about theory 2. Theory 2 says crop circles were made by extraterrestrials. Never is it said how, of course, right? We don't know how their engines work. We don't know how their vehicles work. We don't know anything at all about them. So the how is a bit of a mystery. What's the evidence for this? Well, let's use our criteria. Crop circles are pretty complex. Aliens are at least intelligent creatures, according to the stories. So if an intelligent thing were behind them, that might explain why they're so complex, right? If a pig were making crop circles, you wouldn't expect it to look the way it looks. But if an intelligent being were behind it, you might expect some degree of complexity. But of course, humans can create crop circles too, right? And we can't explain the sightings in better ways than saying aliens, of which we know very little, if not nothing. So the conclusion here isn't that the alien story is necessarily false. The conclusion is just that it's not that simple. On the alien story, you have humans discovering crop circles created by aliens. But what if it were just done by humans? Wouldn't that be a simpler theory? In that theory, you don't need aliens or spaceships or alien technology at all. You just need human beings who are also intelligent. And that theory is far simpler in that it makes fewer assumptions than the conclusion. And of course, we know this is how it was done. Bauer and Corley in England started making crop circles, and they actually came forward in 1991 to tell how it was done. It's remarkably easy. You really just need a 2x4 and some wood. You put a stake in the ground, and you let out a little length of rope, put the 2x4 on the ground, and step on it and push the crops over. Take a step, do it again, take a step, do it again, make a circle, let out a little more rope, do another circle, make a path, make another circle, make a path, make a triangle. You can do any shape you want. Takes a couple hours. Only a few people could do a full acre in a single night. So we know how it's done, even elaborate designs. But every crop circle around the world, how do they spread? Alien spaceships are really fast, right? So that they could see a crop circle in Europe just as you could see a crop circle in South America. But of course, you could see these on the news, and it doesn't take an intelligent human very long to figure out how to do it, or at least replicate it. That probably better explains the spread than alien technology. At least it's a simpler theory. And we knew it was simpler the whole time. So without direct evidence, what do we have? We have a choice between a simple theory, humans did it, a more complicated theory, aliens did it, and a theory that doesn't even explain the thing it's trying to explain, the complexity of crop circles in the wind vortex theory. So which should we believe? We should believe humans did it. Could I be wrong? Could it turn out that it's aliens later? Sure. There's a 0.00 whatever chance that it could be that. And if we get direct evidence for that later, I'll change my mind. I'll admit I was wrong. But what is it most reasonable to believe now? At this moment, it's most reasonable to believe the simplest theory that is conservative and fits with other things we think we know about the world. And we should believe the theory that makes fruitful predictions, that has broad scope, and that's testable. And of course, the theory that humans did it is all of those things. We can test it. We could go out and make our own crop circles. It has broad scope. Hey, if we make patterns in circles, maybe we also paint designs on cave walls, and maybe we also paint art for museums, and maybe we also make sculptures, and maybe we do other things that are aesthetically beautiful. And of course we do. It fits with other things we know about human beings. We like pulling pranks on each other, don't we? So that theory seems to satisfy all of our criteria. I look forward to the examples you give in the discussion forum. So, to sum up and to put it in the pattern of IBE, the phenomenon we were trying to explain was crop circles. We looked at 3 different brief explanations for them, talking through some of our criteria. And the best explanation is that it was humans did it. So our inference is that it's probable that crop circles are the work of humans. And that's pretty strong. That's a really solid argument. We could still be wrong, of course. And it could be that some new explanation comes along tomorrow that might be better than the one we have now. That's all fine. That is simply how explanations work. That's how science works. But at any given time, there is only a certain amount of evidence, and there are only certain available alternatives for what we could believe. And we've got to pick the one that satisfies most of our criteria the best. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a good time in the discussion forum proposing your theories. I look forward to reading about them. Thanks.